I'm Ajay Makan, a psychiatrist working here in Johannesburg, South Africa. Today I want to talk about substances from the perspective of the mind. As much as we might go to a hospital for other organs, be it our kidney, liver, spleen, generally when we get admitted to a rehab facility, it's because we're struggling with the mind. What is it about the mind that we all struggle with? And over the years I've asked this question, people will give me various answers. But the one answer we all agree on is the fact that the mind is manufacturing thoughts. In the case of people who get admitted into a rehab facility, it's the fact that the thoughts are negative. It can be just one negative thought a day that manifests continuously, or it can be just numerous negative thoughts that lead to a negative state, poor mood, poor sleep, appetite, and energy. So, in terms of the mind, it's the thoughts that we struggle with. Studies have been done as to how many thoughts we have in a day. It's described that we have up to 60,000 thoughts a day. Many of us will feel that, hey, we actually have more than 60,000 thoughts a day. Some of us feel we probably have hundreds, 200,000 thoughts a day. Because there's loads of thoughts, fleeting thoughts, visual thoughts, auditory thoughts, emotional thoughts, all kinds of things, and sometimes thoughts that we don't even know exist. Probably, there's more truth in what the Buddha said. The Buddha said, there's trillions of thoughts a day, but for a blink of an eye, we don't have a thought, we've achieved a state of bliss. Now, what's that got to do with us being admitted into a rehab facility? Many of us are taking substances to achieve that state of bliss, to have that numbed state where there are no thoughts. Let's elaborate a bit more. In terms of thoughts that we have, or the substances we use, we numb the thoughts because the thoughts are a source of pain. But that's not the reason why we originally used the substance. We originally used the substance because it was a source of pleasure. But what gradually happens over time is the pleasure dissipates. We need more of the substance to achieve that same high, and therefore we take more and more and more. Eventually, the pleasure zone dissipates. We then start using the substances to reduce the pain. And that's where we endeavor to achieve that state of bliss. Beyond the thoughts, we all have then feelings. The feelings are what we struggle with because they are negative in nature. Hurt, sorrow, anger, depression, anxiety, agitation, irritability, frustration, name it, we get it. So these are some of the thoughts and feelings that we have. Sometimes some might say, I have the feelings and then the thoughts, and that's also true. If you think of young children, they feel before they learn to think. We teach them how to think in a logical and rational manner. Sometimes we find our thoughts don't correlate with our feelings. We can't express our thoughts in terms of what we feel. So, yes, we can have feelings before thoughts, but as humans, as we grow up, we have replace our thinking and suppress our feelings. Now, all very well that we have the thinking and the feelings, but because of how much we think and how much we feel as humans, we act on our thoughts. And our acting on our thoughts is which leads to negative consequences. And the more we act on it, the more the action becomes a habit. Now, it's well known in this day and age that they say to become a genius, we need 10,000 hours of repetitive action, and therefore we become a genius at something. Now, what's interesting, and I say this ironically, one might argue, is that in order to be a genius at something, we need 10,000 hours, but many of us have spent 10,000 hours doing things that no one's pays us for, like using substances. Sadly, and I say this in inverted commas, we all become geniuses at various things, be it substance use, be it depression, be it anxiety. We are brilliant at so many things, but the problem with that genius trait is no one's prepared to pay us for it to put our statues up in some square. So we have all become geniuses in terms of thinking, feeling, and acting in a way which has had negative consequences for us. The habit has become a right, has become a ritual for all of us. We do it instinctively. Now, if we take it back to the mind, what's interesting, what's happening to the mind, is that it's forming a neuronal pathway in the brain. Consequently, we are firing the brain and wiring the brain. And as we wire that brain, we are also firing that brain. So what's happening is that neuronal pathway is forming on a daily basis. It goes into autopilot. And how do I describe this? It's like driving a car. As much as we might have all driven here, we have no clue how many times we press the brake, the gears, the accelerator, the clutch. We just did it on autopilot because we've been doing it for so long. And human beings, we live on autopilot. We, like on the hamster wheel, we're just going around and around and around. That thought, that feeling, that action has become our repetitive habit. There's even books written about habits called atomic habits. The habits of changing our habits to try and become geniuses. So these are all the things that happen to us in terms of our brain. And it just doesn't manifest in the brain. It also manifests in our bodies. And that's where the habit also influences our behavior. The way we walk, the way we talk, in fact, the way we breathe is as a result of the way we think, we feel, and we act, and the habits we create. So something interesting over the years I've done, I used to ask patients who are depressed, take a deep breath in. And they would literally lift their shoulders up to the ceiling. And I used to wonder why originally. And then I realized what they're doing is carrying the world on their shoulders. They take on all the responsibilities of the world. Patients who are anxious will take short, sharp, fast breaths. Why? They're always in panic mode. The fight, flight, fright reaction has been triggered at the slightest trigger, slightest stressor. So it's fascinating. The fundamental means to survival, which is breathing, is influenced by the thoughts, the feelings, and the actions and the habits we have. Rather than breathing slowly, deeply, and taking long breaths, we take short, sharp, fast breaths. And that's even because of the lifestyle we live in. We become so wired. We become like, I want to give an analogy, and this is an experiment that was done, of what they did is they put a frog into water. And they did it for various other reasons, not for the outcome that they found out. They put it into room temperature water and they heated the water 1 degree at a time until the water for the frog, in terms of temperature, became uncomfortable. Do you think the frog jumped out? Something interesting, it didn't. It stayed in until it became absolutely uncomfortable. They took another frog and they put it into uncomfortably hot water, and that frog immediately hopped out. We humans, though, in the same way, will hop out of water if it's too hot in terms of circumstances and situation. But if we become acclimatized to the situation and circumstance, we tend to stay in. We live in circumstances which are painful, full of suffering, full of anger, yet we stay in. We become acclimatized. But how do we do that? Our bodies, our minds are adjusting and tolerating the suffering, the hurt, the trauma. But what's also happening, we are doing physical and mental damage to ourselves. Our cortisol levels are shooting through the roof. Our adrenaline is pumping. Our heart rates are high. Our blood pressure, pulse, everything is shooting up. So we become acclimatized to stress. So this has fundamentally determined our behavior and then eventually becomes part of our character, our personality. Interesting, if you look at the trend I've mentioned, it's the mind that creates the thoughts, the feelings, the actions. Repetitive action leads to a habit, and therein determines our behavior. Lo and behold, our behavior tells us about our character and personality. The type of people we are, the type of fundamental personality traits we have taken on because of the circumstances and situations. And the type of people that walk out there and talk out there and that we engage with are determined by the environment. So fundamentally, our characters and personalities are generally, as much as it can be nurture-driven, also nature-driven. That means the circumstances and situations has determined who we are. So we might say, what's wrong with that? What's the consequence? What if we have turned out to be angry people, depressed people, anxious people? Far more important than that is that all these things, the thoughts, the feelings, the actions, the habits, the behavior and character determines our destiny. In fact, if we look at this situation, even today, I'm sitting here as a result of thoughts, feelings, actions, habits, behavior and character that determine this destiny of sitting in this particular chair at this time. But beyond that, some of us are in a negative emotional state and we wonder how. That's the destiny we created. If we're angry, that's the destiny we created. Or the people, for example, in this room or even watching this video, all the thoughts, the feelings, the actions, the habits you have created this destiny of watching this video. So lo and behold, as much as we feel this is what we wanted, we created it. And as much as we didn't want it, we also created it. And many people struggle with it. And let me give you a practical example to say why. As much as we may have not wanted this destiny, this particular moment in time, why are we there? For example, if someone decides that they want to break into a home and steal the laptop, as much as they do that, why do they do that? It's because they want to get the laptop, a chance to sell it for a few thousands of rands or dollars or whatever denomination of currency of the country they live in. And they want to utilize their money for whatever it means. However, the chance they break into the house, rather than ending up having to sell the laptop, they get caught by the police and end up in jail. As much as they didn't choose the destiny, the thoughts, the feelings, the actions determined the consequence. As much as you wanted a positive consequence, the consequence turned out to be negative. Lo and behold, as much as we intend to carry or pursue a positive destiny, we also can create negative destinies. There's something very interesting about the mind. As much as some of us in this situation, be it using substances, be it being depressed, be it being anxious, none of us choose to be there in terms of that negative state. So it's something very interesting. The mind, the story in the mind is not being played out. If you're in a negative space, life hasn't listened to your logic and rationality. What do you and I have to do? We have to give up the mind's logic, the mind's rationality, and listen to life's story. Life plays out a very different story, has a very different view on logic and rationality. As much as our mind pursues logic, rationality, story, it's even movie. Your life has a different logic, rationality, story, and movie in line. So we have to give up that mind and pursue something more. So one might ask, how do I deliberately and consciously change the destiny that I am in at the moment? The most popular answer, some might say, is to change our thoughts. Yes, changing thoughts are important. Positive thinking is important. Reaffirming our thinking in a positive way is important. Repeating the positive thoughts are important. However, many of us in this day and age know that just thinking positively does not necessarily give you the outcome you want. We have all, at some level, tried thinking positively. You might call it Psychology 101, where I tried to think positive thoughts, but it didn't work out for me. So what do we have to do? As much as we think, feel, act, develop habits, endeavor to create a behavior and character that leads to a particular destiny, we all know that sometimes that doesn't work out in the way we want it to. And the question is why? Now, if you look at the mind, what we've done is discuss the outputs of the mind. The thinking, the feeling, the actions, the habits, the behavior. Those are all the outputs. But the question comes up, what is the inputs? Where do the inputs come from? And if you think of our mind, where does it get its inputs from? It gets its inputs via the senses. What we see, what we feel or touch, or what we smell or what we hear. All these things create our inputs. And these inputs are, in every individual's case, the circumstances and the situations that feed into the mind. We see them, we hear them, we might even touch them. In this day and age, we are overwhelmed by input. We are overwhelmingly stimulated with, for example, social media. We hear of a thing trending this morning. We can immediately access video and auditory inputs regarding that input. The problem in this day and age is a lot of these manufactured inputs are negative in nature. They feed the mind. And what happens is the mind collects this negativity. Then there's a particular situation, as much as we might hear of an earthquake in another part of the world, it may not impact on us. But there's something that's close to home that can impact us. And it's more so, has an ability to impact us if we give that input value, we give it importance, we give it energy. So the people in our immediate circle are more likely to impact us. And if we perceive that they have done something negative, it impacts us even more. So lo and behold, as much as we may think of positive thoughts, positive feelings, positive actions, the fact that the people and circumstances in our lives can be so negative, they will overwhelm our positive thinking. And what happens then? Remember the original pathway that may have led us to a depressed, anxious, substance-using situation? That pathway, that neuronal pathway which we dug in our brain over the years, as much as we originally built it with a chisel, we eventually were using bulldozers and bulldozing that pathway, firing and wiring the brain. That comes into play again. The body or the mind recognizing that the situation it's facing is negative, it goes down that usual neuronal pathway. As much as you blocked it off, the damn wall burst. And lo and behold, we fly down that negative pathway. Why does that do that? And why do we do that? So there's something very important to recognize and to understand. And this is how the mind operates. What the mind does, recognize when the mind is faced with any situation or circumstance, it measures and calculates the situation. We have been taught that from grade 000 to school to university and postdoctorate, that the mind is amazing in terms of coming up with solutions. However, when we are faced with an absolutely negative situation, for example, let's choose something, a loss of a family member, or getting COVID in this day and age. You and I know this, no matter how much, if we lose someone, we can never get them back. The mind knows there is no solution, or it figures out there is no solution. When you have COVID, you and I are faced with complete uncertainty and insecurity. We're not sure sometimes whether we're going to live or die. The mind's function is to keep us safe, to protect us. On a daily basis, we may go out looking for food, or we may go out looking for shelter, or we may go out looking for water. But fortunately, we don't necessarily do those things. We do it in a different manner. We go and work so we can afford these things. So we don't necessarily think about those things. So on a daily basis, we ensure we are not just in a state of survival, but in a zone of comfort. So we make sure that food-wise, water-wise, shelter-wise, that we are comfortable. It's a cold day today, so we wear warmer clothes. If it's a hot day, we'll take off some clothing. So therefore, the mind keeps us safe physically. Beyond physical comfort, there's something else that the mind then does, because then it might even get a bit bored if there's nothing to do in order to keep us physically safe. It then endeavors to keep us mentally safe. How does it do that? It protects our identity, how we see ourselves. If I use a different word, it protects our ego. What happens is when we are faced with that negative situation, for example, the COVID, we have an identity that I am so and so, I have this job, I have these family members who depend on me. That identity is then threatened, so we feel unsafe. No more is there a lion at the door that makes us want to go into fight, flight, fright. It's the fact that our life is at stake. If we lose someone close to us, our identity in relationship to them is threatened. Not just threatened, it's been taken away. We now have no one else to relate to, be it a parent that was always there for us. The mind feels threatened. It goes into a fight, flight, fright mode and goes down that negative pathway that causes depression, anxiety, stress, anger, irritability. Rather than choosing the highway, it chooses the low way. Rather than choosing the negative way, rather than choosing the positive way, it chooses a negative way, because the mind has no solution to that problem. Given it has no solution to that problem, it resorts to a primitive fight, flight, fright response, or reaction, should I say. How then, given the circumstances and situations we face in life, how then do we endeavor to choose the high, positive road? What do we have to do? So a question I ask generally is, how many choices, if we face with a negative situation, do we have? And the general answer I might get is two. One is that you can become depressed or you endeavor to be happy. In many ways, there is an element of truth to that, because that's how the brain or the mind functions. It looks for a solution and it endeavors to employ the solution if it can. If it can't, it just gets negative, it becomes a victim, it becomes depressed. But in absolute reality, we have infinite choices in every situation. Why do I say that? We have infinite choices if we refuse to categorize choice as plain pain or pleasure, right or wrong, happy or sad. You and I give different values to different situations because we decided to give it importance in our life, give it energy. We might even give someone love. The chance we give them love and they let us down, we feel hurt, we feel wronged, we feel bad. Then the mind has no choice but to go into a mode of depression, anxiety, anger, irritability. But because we have given it that value and energy, that person then has taken on precedence in our lives. We have decided that they have control over our minds. And therefore, we need certain circumstances and situations to turn out in a particular way for the mind to be well. What we have done, alas, is made the mind the master of who we are. What we need to recognize that the mind is a poor master. The mind is more importantly a servant to us. We can understand why we have made over time the mind the master. Maybe around the 1400s, most of us, when we didn't faced with a situation that we could not understand, we attributed it to magic, to mystery, to mysticism. Back then, inappropriately, it was logical to call someone sadly a witch or a wizard or something to that extent. If we could not see out into the oceans past a certain point, we assumed there were dragons and the earth was flat. So we did not replace magic, mystery with mysticism until around the 1400s, 1500s, where you had a man like Descartes who came along and said, I think, therefore I am. So what happened is, the magic, the mysticism, and the mystery got replaced by logic and rationality. In this day and age, we have very little magic, mystery, and mysticism. Everything is logical and rational. Even kids, when they watch magic tricks, endeavor to figure it out. In fact, they probably figure it out better than you and I, because they go onto YouTube and endeavor to understand the logic and rationality of the magic that the magician is performing. And what we feel is that there's a logical and rational answer to everything. However, we all know situations where no matter how much logic and rationality we have, we do not have a solution. Be it someone we've lost, be it with the current COVID virus, there is no logical or rational solution that will keep us alive sometimes. All these things create no logical and rational solution to the situation. The mind is in a quandary. It goes into pain, hurt, and suffering. What we need to recognize is to remove the mind as a master, make it a servant. There are infinite choices and possibilities if we refuse to categorize choice as pain or pleasure, right or wrong, happy or sad. In fact, Elon Musk, who is well known in the world, a question was asked of him, "Why are you so successful?" And he gave an interesting answer. He says, "I have a high threshold for pain." What we do as human beings and what the mind does is avoids pain. But in some situations, pain is inevitable. We need to face up to the pain. We need to face up to the hurt and suffering. Not just for the sake of them, in achievement of some purpose, some truth, some meaning. In fact, Viktor Frankl says something very interesting. He says, he wrote a book, Man's Search for Meaning, and he was a psychiatrist, for those who don't know, who served, I don't want to use the word time, but was incarcerated in a concentration camp during World War II. He says there are three sources of meaning: work, relationships, and suffering. They're in, because sometimes we cannot escape work, we can't escape relationships, and sometimes, as in his case, he could not escape the suffering. He had to find meaning. And those who, let's use the word, set themselves free, find meaning in what they're going through. So what you and I have to do, we need to learn to control the mind. Learn to control the mind like a lion grabs a goat by its neck. Hold on to that mind. Another way of putting it is this: some people are controlled by the mind, and some people control the mind. We all need to endeavor to be the latter, where we control the mind. If we control the mind, we control our thoughts, our feelings, our actions. Lo and behold, we determine our habits, our behavior, our character. That way, we determine our destiny. Thank you.